Leaders of the Pacific Rim were in Peru last week to attend this year's Apec summit, the first major global gathering following the election of Donald Trump in the U.S. With more on this multilateral meeting as observed by the press as well as pundits. Do stay with us. Hello and welcome to this week's first edition of Press Perspective. It's Monday, November 18th here in South Korea, and I'm in Sunhee. The Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit came to a close this past weekend in Peru, and today we touch upon this multilateral meeting and more. For this, I have Andres Sanchez Braun, a correspondent for Spanish news agency EFE. Andres, it's great to have you back.
Thank you for having us here as always, Sunhee.
I also have Professor Kim Jae-chun at Sogang University live on the line. Professor Kim, it's a pleasure.
Great to be here. Thanks.
Right, Andres, we'll start here in the studio. Let's begin with the interaction between President Yoon Suk Yeol and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping on the margins of the APEC meeting in Peru. What did they address, and what are your thoughts regarding this latest bilateral interaction?
Well, I think actually in regards of the sideline meetings that President Yoon had in Lima in Peru, I think probably the one with Xi was the one that was most important in the sense that, you know, meetings, for example, with Joe Biden or Prime Minister Ishiba from Japan are more frequent. And given that, you know, the fact that there's going to be an incoming Trump administration in the U.S., I think it was a perfect timing to meet President Xi in this case. Now, I would say there were two main takeaways in their meeting. One was related to President Yoon asking Xi for a constructive role in regards of the increased military cooperation between Moscow and Pyongyang, especially regarding the deployment of North Korean troops in the Kursk region in what is now the Ukrainian war front. Xi Jinping didn't directly respond to this, but he did say that he's very interested in maintaining peace and stability in the Korean Peninsula. And, you know, we do know that this deployment of troops to Ukraine does have potential effects in the security environment of not only the peninsula, but the whole Asia-Pacific region. And then again, when it comes to China, sometimes it's more, it's not as important what Beijing says, but what it's actually not saying. And I think we all believe that Beijing is not happy with this increased military cooperation, and definitely not with the deployment of North Korean troops to the Ukrainian front, especially at a time when I think with an incoming upcoming Trump administration, China is going to put more importance in portraying itself as, you know, as a state that puts heavy weight, for example, on stability and being more soft-spoken in that sense. So that said, Seoul obviously knows the important role that Beijing plays in both as an ally and even more importantly as an economic sponsor of both Beijing and of Moscow and Pyongyang. Seoul is very aware of how important it is for Beijing to speak up and try to convince both its allies to backtrack on this deployment of troops. The other main takeaway, I would say, was obviously regarding the economy. President Yoon called for a predictable and stable business environment between the two countries, and then both President Xi and President Yoon called for an upgrade of the FDA, which has just turned 10 years. And of course, these matters were discussed at a time where we're barely 2 months away from Donald Trump taking power in Washington. And of course, there's fear of what is going to happen with the so-called promise of levying tariffs on South Korean goods, Chinese goods, and who knows, maybe even asking for harsher restrictions when it comes to Chinese access to sensitive technologies such as semiconductors. So all of this obviously has potential and very important repercussions both for the Chinese and the Korean economy. So I think it was in the best interest of both countries that they start discussing potential scenarios.
Right. Then keeping in mind what Andres has just said, Professor Kim, do you foresee enhanced cooperation between Korea and China amid a second Trump administration in the U.S.?
I think so. You know, the relationship between the two countries, South Korea and China, was going through a low point in past 2.5 years. President Yoon, you know, as soon as he came into the office, he took great pains to upgrade the ROC-US alliance to a value-based, comprehensive global alliance partnership. And those efforts weren't really well received by Beijing. So Beijing sort of retaliated with coercive diplomacy, you know, wolf warrior diplomacy to a certain extent. But the thing is that President Yoon didn't really back down. President Yoon maintained a very disciplinary approach to China and asked for reciprocal respect from China. That said, I think beginning this year, both countries came to a realization that confrontationist approach doesn't really pay. So both countries were trying to reach out to each other, you know, to improve the relationship and all. And now, as you said, with Trump's election victory, I think South Korea is in a position where we can't really place all the bets on the U.S. side. You know, we have to sort of diversify our foreign policy portfolio. And as for China, with the election of Trump, I think there is an opening for China to improve relationship with neighboring countries such as South Korea. So I do foresee more enhanced cooperation between the two countries.
Right. Meanwhile, Andres, prior to departing for the Apec summit in Peru, President Yoon Suk Yeol had a written interview with you, I believe. What was the gist of his message?
That is right. We managed to conduct a written interview with President Yoon prior to his departure, both to the APEC forum and then the G20 that is taking place from today in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Again, I would point to a couple of big takeaways from the interview. One would be that President Yoon underlined the fact that his government is carefully analyzing different scenarios, different contingencies. It's taking it step by step in regards of the deployment of North Korean troops to the Ukrainian front that we've mentioned. And of course, one of the options that the South Korean government is meditating or thinking on possibly implementing, as I say, this is their approach wants to be step by step and seeing how this contingency develops in the Ukrainian front. But one of the options is increasing support for Ukraine, obviously. Now, President Yoon didn't want to elaborate further on this for obvious reasons, but we do know that Seoul has stuck to the principles of its Foreign Trade Act when it comes to providing, let's say, sensitive goods, in this case, weaponry or military equipments to countries involved in wars, which is Ukraine's case. Now, of course, I think there's a the options are quite broad in the sense of how Seoul could increase support of Ukraine other than directly supplying offensive weapons, for example, especially now that President Biden just authorized the use of U.S.-made missiles, ATACMS, and ATACMS in this case to target Russian assets in Russian territory. Of course, one of the possibilities is increasing stocks for countries that do provide weaponry directly to Ukraine. But as I say, I think there's a wide range of options, and it all depends on how this deployment of North Korean troops develops. The other main takeaway, as we pointed out, this is President Yoon's first trip to Latin America, and EFE is not only the fourth largest newswire in the world, but the most present one in Latin America. So obviously he wanted to talk about South Korea's current interest in increasing and solidifying ties with the region. And I think we could see, we saw some of this already in Lima when President Yoon met Peruvian President Boluarte. And they both talked on increasing cooperation, for example, in terms of minerals and mineral resources, or, for example, defense, which is something very interesting for South Korean manufacturers because they consider Peru to be some sort of a gateway into the broader Latin American market, and that's something very important to them given how they've set these very ambitious goals for the next few years of increasing sales worldwide.
Right. Meanwhile, Professor Kim, going back to a point that Andres made earlier on, what is the likelihood, Professor Kim, of South Korea offering lethal weapons to Ukraine amid an incoming Trump administration?
I think it's important for South Korea to continuously take a firm stance against Russia's ill-conceived war of aggression. And with North Korea's dispatching of military troops to the Ukraine battlefield, now we are a major stakeholder country to the war. We can't just afford being an onlooker here anymore. So I think it's necessary for South Korea to take some measures, steps to cope with evolving situations there in Ukraine. But that said, I think offering lethal weapons should wait. I think we'll have to take one step after another. In my personal opinion, now is the stage where we can dispatch a group of observers or observation delegation, if you will, so that we can get to know more. We can get to know more about what really is going on there. In case North Korean soldiers are captured, South Korean observers can help Ukraine to integrate them if needs arise. I think those are the steps that we can take now. Lethal weapons, I think lethal weapons should be the last resort. Besides, Mr. Trump is taking office January next year, so we'll have to wait and see how Trump's policy toward Ukraine would unfold.
Right. Andres, concerns over global security, of course, they were also addressed at the Apec summit, where world leaders sought to ensure a strong, inclusive and thriving global economy. That being said, what were some of your takeaways from that multilateral meeting?
Well, as you know, Apec is mostly an economic forum, so there's little space for real political decision making to come out of these meetings, obviously. But then again, it's the 21 economies in the whole Pacific region altogether. But I have to say, probably the most important thing that we saw was the meeting between outgoing President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping. Basically because all comes down once again to the fact that in 2 months' time we're going to have Donald Trump back in the White House, and we're all bracing ourselves to see what this is going to mean, for example, for multilateralism or for a forum like Apec itself, right? Obviously, I think the word exchange between President Biden and President Xi was very cordial. President Xi actually said that China is ready to work with a new U.S. administration. He also warned that, he actually literally said that if we take each other as adversaries, we most probably will set back the relationship. So he's also warning of the fact that, you know, if Washington wants to play hardball, well, it's definitely not going to sit well with the progress, if any, that has been made in the past 4 years, right? But I would say that we saw some sort of detente between the U.S. and China, and well, this is something that we might not see for the next 4 years. It depends on what Mr. Trump and his administration have in store. But as I think we've been seeing in the past few days how he's lining up his cabinet, it doesn't seem that he, at least in principle, will have a soft approach to China.
Right. And Andres, before we delve into the fate of the multilateral Apec summit under Trump's administration, I'd like to turn one question, of course, to Professor Kim about, speaking as a scholar, Professor Kim, what is your assessment of this year's Apec gathering?
Well, this year's gathering meant a lot because it was the last gathering before Mr. Trump takes office next year. So we have yet to figure out what Mr. Trump would bring to the world. I think there was a sense of anxiety shared by many countries in the world. Some countries are less anxious than others, but I think it's a matter of degree. And then APEC countries in general were quite anxious about, you know, protectionist policies and outrageous tariffs that Mr. Trump promised on campaign trails. You know, APEC was created to deepen economic cooperation between some 20 member countries, you know, to promote free trade and facilitate economic cooperation. But I think now that spirit of economic cooperation isn't just there anymore. And then to me, it was quite interesting to see Chinese leader Xi Jinping spoke the language of free trade and economic connectedness. I don't think the second administration is going to speak the language of free trade and economic connectedness. So to me, anxiety is the word that best describes the sentiment shared by APEC member countries this year.
Right, indeed. And Andres, as Professor Kim mentioned, anxiety, I understand, it's being shared by many pundits in Europe as well as leaders with regard to the fate of multilateral dialogue platforms under a second Trump administration. What more can you add?
Yes, of course. There's big concerns in Europe, and not only, as Professor Kim mentioned, all these promises of huge tariffs. It could be on European goods, Chinese goods, etc. But especially on the multilateral spectrum, we all remember what happened with the Paris Climate Agreement and how the first Trump administration walked out of that, or what happened with the Iran nuclear deal, also a multilateral deal that took years to sign, and how the Trump administration walked out on that and the effects it's had on the region. But I think one particular concern for Europe right now is the future of NATO, of course. We all remember how President Trump heavily criticized the organization in his first term and was calling out for all members to increase their spending up to 2% of their national GDPs, and was crying out telling members that they were basically free loaders on U.S. dollars. What is of special concern now is what kind of decisions is President Trump going to make regarding Ukraine, and what effects this is going to have on NATO, because many are predicting already that he's going to concede nice ground to Russia in negotiations. He'd be willing to do important concessions and basically leave Ukraine very exposed, and in consequence leave Eastern European countries highly exposed to potential Russian aggression. So of course a number of measures, I think, are already being discussed among European countries. Also, I think it's important to point out that this is not 2016 in Europe anymore. The current environment, you have quite weak governments in Berlin and Paris, for example, and the fact that far-right parties have higher quotas of power in Europe. So that conditions the situation much more. As I just mentioned, there's some measures being discussed already, I think. Things like, for example, increasing defense spending no matter what happens to NATO or the war in Ukraine, strengthening internal consumption, increasing investment, possibly trying to have a better relationship with China. I think, as Professor Kim pointed out also I think a lot of U.S. allies now are going to have to rethink their strategies and try to diversify their diplomatic investments in that sense. And I think one clear point here is that Europe clearly has to try to strengthen ties even more with fellow democracies. And of course, in that case, Korea is a country that is being underlined, together with the UK, Australia, Canada, Japan, on the importance of strengthening ties with these countries that share the same values, and in order to try to strengthen multilateralism as much as possible, of course.
Right, and as Professor Kim was saying, basically seek to diversify diplomatic endeavors with like-minded partners then. I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Andres, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts. And Professor Kim, thank you so much for your insights today.
Thank you.
Right, well, that ends Monday's edition of Press Perspective. Do join us again same time tomorrow. Thank you for now.